Thank you, Menika Doshi, for that introduction. And it's an honor to be part of the Mumbai Press Club's RedInk Awards and to take stock of all the wonderful work the fraternity has done over the last couple of years. It's been an extremely difficult couple of years for journalists in India. Consider the fact that the network of Women in Media for India have put out data saying that we've lost 474 journalists to COVID, most of whom were on the field when they contracted the virus. It's an extremely worrying number. The other things that hurt journalists perhaps were the fact that when there was coverage that needed to be done in the first wave and the second wave, the journalists were on the field, and then when vaccinations were being handed out, journalists were not considered frontline workers by government, which means a lot of the losses that I told you about could have been avoidable. Also, the massive layoffs that we noticed happened during the lockdown, which meant that many journalists who lost their jobs also lost benefits of healthcare for themselves and their families in the middle of a healthcare crisis. And I suppose it's also a good time for us to take stock of the kind of coverage that we've done as a fraternity in this country during maybe what can be described the worst crisis that has hit us in modern times. Did we as journalists ask enough questions, hold government to accountability, and get the answers that our audience, our readers, our viewers really deserve? These are the questions we're examining in this conversation about journalism and the pandemic. Menika has been kind enough to already introduce my panelists, Mr. L.P. Pant, who's the national editor of the Dainik, Bhaskar, and Mr. Siddharth Varadarajan, the founding editor of The Wire. Gentlemen, thank you so much for joining us. Mr. Varadarajan, if I may start with you. And we've already had one conversation on this topic about the media's job in seeking accountability during the pandemic and whether or not we did justice to that job. Do you believe that history will note the Indian media in a positive light and in the work that we've done over the last year? Or is it going to perhaps be a compartmentalized review?
Well, the Indian media isn't a homogeneous body. And I think history will judge very kindly the record of a section of the media. It will write in golden letters the names of freelance journalists and other reporters who went out there in the field without any kind of institutional backing, without any great protection, and told the kind of stories that needed to be told in the face of the large or the big section of the media basically abdicating responsibility. So I think history will judge one section kindly, but the major section, I think for a variety of reasons, is going to score pretty badly, not just in terms of the failure to educate the public on the medical or epidemiological aspects of the pandemic, but in failing to highlight failures of governance, failures of administration in a timely fashion when they needed to be done so that correctives could be taken. But worst of all, for buying into a certain political narrative that the ruling establishment fostered, in part to cover up its own ineptitude, but also because that's simply what the DNA of the ruling establishment is, which is to use every opportunity to divide the people of India on religious grounds and foster insecurity and foster suspicion. And I think history will be very, very cruel, and rightly so, to that section of the media which played this game and which was complicit in, shall we say, turning the pandemic into an instrument for fostering suspicion, division, insecurity, hatred. And I think this is something that was really quite unforgivable.
I'm going to take this question to Mr. Pant as well. Mr. Pant, Dainik Bhaskar was very vociferous in its coverage. You ran some very strong headlines on your front page, something that was missing from English dailies, for example. It was definitely missing from television. Nobody called a spade a spade. You posted your reporters at crematoriums to actually check and verify numbers vis-a-vis what the government was telling us. And you also, your organization received a raid, which we have seen happen quite often. In your opinion, Mr. Pant, क्या आपके opinion में क्या बोलेंगे कि इंडियन मीडिया ने सही किया, या ऐसे काफी सारे बड़े बड़े जो न्यूज़पेपर्स पब्लिकेशंस थे, जो अंग्रेजी के पब्लिकेशंस है, जो हमारे नेशनल टेलीविजन चैनल्स हैं, उन्होंने शायद सच नहीं दिखाया?
एक लंबी डिबेट है और ये लगातार इस डिबेट को चलता रहेगा, लेकिन एक जर्नलिस्ट के तौर पर जैसे सिद्धार्थ जी ने बताया, मैं इस दायरे को थोड़ा और खोलना चाहता हूँ। एक जर्नलिस्ट के तौर पर कोरोना की पहली और दूसरी लहर एक पत्रकार के तौर पर मेरे जीवन की सबसे बड़ी कहानी है और सबसे बड़ी परीक्षा भी। दैनिक भास्कर ने अखबार के तौर पर, क्योंकि जब आपके आसपास जब एक मतलब जीवन की सबसे महत्वपूर्ण और सबसे बड़ी घटना चल रही हो, तो निष्पक्ष और विश्वसनीय रिपोर्ट करना आपकी सबसे बड़ी चुनौती होती है, और दैनिक भास्कर ने वही किया। हमारे आप 2 करोड़ हमारे पास रीडर हैं, और उस वक्त जिस वक्त सरकारी जो डेटा थे वो भ्रम फैला रहे थे, मौत और मरीजों के आंकड़े गलत ढंग से पेश किए जा रहे थे, तो ऐसे में हमारी एक जिम्मेदारी थी, क्योंकि हमारा पाठक उस वक्त बिल्कुल अकेला था, बेबस था, और उसके पास सही और सही जानकारी की सबसे ज्यादा जरूरत थी, और वो भूमिका हमने निभाई। इसने क्या किया वो एक अलग डिबेट है, लेकिन इसमें जो सबसे महत्वपूर्ण पहलू है कि भाई हमारे साथ क्या हुआ, ये क्या नहीं हुआ, हमने ये नहीं देखा कि किस राज्य में किसकी सरकार है। उदाहरण के तौर राजस्थान में हमने कोविड पे जिस गलत डेटा पर राजस्थान में स्टोरी की, तो वहाँ कांग्रेस की सरकार है। हमने एमपी में स्टोरीज की, वहां पर बीजेपी की सरकार है। हमने बिहार में स्टोरी की, वहाँ एनडीए की सरकार है। तो हमने ये नहीं देखा कि किस राज्य में किसकी सरकारें हैं, हमने सरकारों से सिर्फ सवाल पूछे, और वो एक मतलब एक पत्रकार के तौर पर, एक अखबार के तौर पर ये हमारी जिम्मेदारी थी, क्योंकि उस वक्त ये सूचनाएं जिस तरीके से आ रही थी, मतलब मौत और मरीजों के आंकड़े जिस तरीके से मतलब दिखाए जा रहे थे, उसको लेकर हमको लगा कि ये सबसे महत्वपूर्ण है, और एज ए जर्नलिस्ट के तौर पर भी नहीं, एक अखबार के तौर पर हमारी सबसे बड़ी भूमिका ही यही थी। तो वो किसी हेडलाइन का इस्तेमाल किया करना हो, खबरों की कॉपी हो, हमारे कई साथियों ने हमारे साथ काम करने वाले इस महामारी में कई साथियों ने जान भी गंवाई, लेकिन बावजूद उसके हमने जिस आपने देखा होगा कि हमने कैसे काम किया। लेकिन सबसे महत्वपूर्ण पक्ष ये है कि जो झूठ था उसको हमने सच दिखाने की कोशिश की।
मिस्टर पंत, क्या आपको ऐसा भी लगता है कि जितने पत्रकार ने सच दिखाने की कोशिश की थी, उन पे भी दबाव आ गया था उस टाइम पे, जैसे आपके यहाँ रेड पड़ गई थी?
ये तो देखिए क्या होता है कि आप जब किसी भी सरकार से सवाल करते हो तो आपको उसकी कीमत चुकानी होती है। ये तो एक डिबेट, इसमें कोई नई बात नहीं है कोई भी, और ये कोई पहली बार भी नहीं है। लेकिन सवाल महत्वपूर्ण बस ये है कि हम एज ए जर्नलिस्ट के तौर पर, एक अखबार के तौर पर हमारी भूमिका क्या थी। हमने वही भूमिका निभाई है। मैंने जैसे पहले बताया कि हमने किसकी सरकार है, हमने ये नहीं देखा कि किसकी सरकार है, हमने देखा कि सच क्या है।
Mr. Varadarajan, do you agree that this is not new? This kind of pressure on journalists is not new, and it's something that we should be perhaps aware of and prepared for at all times?
Look, pressure of one kind or the other has always been around. But I think in terms of the systematic nature of the pressure being exerted today, the granular nature of the pressure being exerted today, where a reporter in Port Blair could be booked under the Epidemic Diseases Act and other provisions of the IPC simply for tweeting a question to the police about the wisdom of confining to home quarantine an entire family simply because they spoke on the telephone to somebody who has COVID. So in a way, he was mocking the police with a question on Twitter, highlighting a news story that the newspapers in Port Blair had themselves reported, and he got booked under serious provisions of the IPC and had to go to Calcutta High Court a year later before the case was finally thrown out. And that's one example. There are examples from Himachal Pradesh, there are examples from Punjab, plenty of examples from Uttar Pradesh, from Maharashtra, of journalists being, in Tamil Nadu, journalists being penalized, being targeted, being prosecuted, simply for reporting deficiencies in the official response. I'm talking of the first wave mainly here. And frankly, I've never seen anything like this. during the tsunami or other natural disasters or during other moments of national crisis. It's not as if we haven't had challenges that the governments at various levels have had to cope with. But I haven't seen such a systematic effort in targeting individual reporters, targeting editors, targeting publications with punitive measures in the face of their reporting. And I think this is especially unpardonable at a time of a pandemic, because the government and the media really should have seen each other as partners. We are facing a public health emergency. As our colleague from Dainik Bhaskar says, the issue is not one of which party is in power in any particular state. This is not a time for any kind of party politics. And none of us were looking at the political stripe of a party or a government whose ineptitude we were calling out. But the purpose of reporting something was to highlight an issue that may have escaped the notice of the government at the higher level, and to ensure that it gets dealt with. So when a Coimbatore-based local portal reports about shortages in ration shops, the idea isn't to embarrass the Tamil Nadu government or to embarrass the chief minister or to embarrass a local MP. It's to get a problem solved. And the response cannot be to file a criminal case against the reporter. And we sadly saw a lot of this. And I fear that this may well be the start of a new trend where the police and state governments and others who don't like a certain line of reporting or a certain line of questioning will increasingly resort to the filing of criminal cases. So I think there is something new about the kind of pressure that we're seeing.
Well, I want to ask both of you about fact-checking as well. Mr. Pant, I'll start with you. One of the problems that we saw in the media is the lack of fact-checking of a lot of the data that was coming out. You talked about it. They were, sort of Ayurvedic remedies that were launched during the second wave that were carried by the media without questioning, what data they were being offered, why they were union ministers at the launch of these events and things like that. Do you think that at a time when the difference between good information and bad information is life and death, that the media could have done better, Mr. Pant?
जो डेटा है वो देखिए, इस पे देखो डिबेट ही नहीं थी डेटा को लेकर, जितनी बातें हुई हमारा सिर्फ यही कहना था कि भाई मौत और मरीजों के आंकड़े सरकारें रोक नहीं सकती हैं, लेकिन सही जानकारी देकर मुझको एज ए रीडर मुझे जागरूक कर सकते हैं। अगर आप मुझे ये बता दें इस बिल्डिंग में आग लगी है तो मैं उस बिल्डिंग में जाने की कोशिश ही नहीं करूंगा, क्योंकि मुझे ये पता है कि वहां जाके मेरी मौत हो सकती है। हमारा सिर्फ यही कहना था कि डेटा को आप सही जानकारी दीजिए ताकि मुझे पता हो कि मेरे आसपास चल क्या रहा है। दूसरा जो सबसे महत्वपूर्ण फैक्ट था, जो कोरोना मैनेजमेंट की जो अभी डिस्कस भी हुआ, प्रवासी मजदूरों का जो पलायन है ना, उसने हमारे पूरे सिस्टम को हिला कर रख दिया। कि मतलब कोरोना मैनेजमेंट के ध्वस्त होने की सबसे बड़ी कहानी थी प्रवासी मजदूरों का पलायन। वहीं से शुरुआत हुई कि डेटा को ठीक अलग तरीके से दिखाने की, डेटा को घुमा फिरा कर दिखाने की, डेटा को नए संदर्भों में और नई बचाने की कोशिश की। मुझे लगता है कि पता नहीं कौन लोग थे, किस तरीके के लोग थे, या वो कोरोना जो उसके गलत लोगों के हाथों में वो डेटा था, या वो लोग इतने ठीक नहीं थे कि जो महामारी से लड़ सकते थे, शायद सिस्टम में उन लोगों को ठीक से नहीं रखा गया। ये बहुत सारी दिक्कतें हैं, इसीलिए डेटा सही तरीके से बाहर नहीं आ पाया। मुझे लगता है कि सरकारों ने सही लोगों का चयन नहीं किया वहां पर डेटा मैनेजमेंट कर रखने के लिए या कोरोना मैनेजमेंट करने के लिए। तो ये प्रॉब्लम सिस्टम की प्रॉब्लम थी पूरी की पूरी। मुझे लगता है किसी भी सरकार के सामने बहुत चुनौती, उनके लिए पहली बार वो लड़ रहे थे इस महामारी से, उनके लिए सब कुछ नया था, जैसे हम लोगों के लिए बिल्कुल नया था। तो मुझे लगता है कि थोड़ा सा सिस्टम में कुछ गड़बड़ियां थी, सही लोग सही जगहों पर नहीं थे। जर्नलिस्ट के तौर पर हमने वो किया जो हमको करना चाहिए।
Very well said. Mr. Varadarajan, I want to take this one step further to the actual coverage that happened on the ground, the colleagues that we lost, 474 on last count, and the manner in which we as a fraternity managed to protect our journalists. We know a lot of journalists lost their jobs, from some very reputed organizations that laid off people. In your opinion, could that situation have been handled better?
Of course, it should have been handled better, but we are in a situation where over a lengthy period of time, 2 or 3 decades, you've had a weakening of labor protection laws across the board, but especially in the media. So the kind of protections that working journalists enjoyed in the past no longer exist, and some of the biggest offenders are major newspapers. And sadly, the journalists' unions themselves are weak. Most journalists are perhaps not even members of journalist unions. So yeah, the ability of journalists as a collective to respond and articulate and raise this as a point of concern has been, is much weaker today than it might have been, say, 3 decades ago. And sadly, the courts are not receptive. Governments, of course, political parties are not willing to, rub media houses the wrong way, especially if there's a large media house that's laid off, say, 100 people. You will find virtually no political party willing to criticize it because they all hope to benefit from a cozy relationship with that media house, right? So there are structural problems here, which, decades of weakening, institutional, the weakening collective nature of our organizing has created, which is, kind of difficult to get away from. But I think that if you were to separate out the layoffs as one issue, the threat to health as another, and then the legal threats as another, I think that it is inexcusable that the media fraternity as a whole has failed to react unitedly to the legal threats that reporters are being subjected to. Because don't forget, here, this is one case where literally an injury to one is an injury to all. If we allow journalists working for XYZ organization to be prosecuted or arrested for coverage that they do, then tomorrow there's no telling, where the guillotine is going to fall, right? And I think that this failure to recognize the fact that an assault on the media's ability to cover a story will ultimately end up affecting all of us, regardless of our individual political inclinations, regardless of our individual, broader affinities, is a major failure of the Indian media, which I think we are in many ways already living to regret, because the hammer is coming down on more and more organizations as we are seeing.
लेकिन मिस्टर पंत, आपने 2-3 बार बोला कि निष्पक्ष रिपोर्टिंग करने में अभी इश्यूज है, आपके ख्याल में क्यों हो रही है?
ये मैंने बताया ना, इस सिस्टम में जो लोग हैं वो कोई आलोचना सुनना पसंद नहीं करते, तो ये ये ह्यूमन नेचर भी नहीं है। एक इस तरीके की चीजें बनने लगी हैं, व्यवस्था ऐसे बनने लगी हैं, लेकिन ये कोई नई बात नहीं है। बस ये थोड़ा सा इसमें थोड़ा ज्यादा कुछ कम हो सकती है, लेकिन निष्पक्ष और विश्वसनीय रिपोर्टिंग एक चुनौती है। और ये कभी इसका दायरा थोड़ा खुल गया है, लेकिन ये कभी ऐसा नहीं है कि हमेशा से ऐसा रहा है, ये हमेशा चुनौती रहा है।
Mr. Varadarajan, I also want to bring you in on the fact that even today, in most of our states, in almost all of our states, journalists are not considered frontline workers. We don't know whether we're done with COVID. We don't know if Omicron is going to be a new variant of concern in India. Should there be, again, a larger, more cohesive voice from the media demanding that reporters who go out in the field, who are on the ground, be treated as frontline workers when it comes to vaccinations and priorities on healthcare?
I mean, I think when it's done, I mean, it wasn't done immediately, but I think gradually most state governments came around to the view that they ought to treat journalists in the field as frontline workers. And I think that, if I were to today draw, if you were to ask me which is the larger threat that we face as reporters, is it on the public health front? In other words, inability to access PPE or vaccinations or other things that as frontline workers we should get, or is it the danger of legal action for the work that we do? I would say it's very much the latter. A reporter like, and this is, and it's clearly spread beyond the pandemic. Like look at the look at the treatment that journalists who went to Tripura were meted out, right? Being hounded, being booked for sedition. Look at Siddiq Kapan's case. It's been more than a year that he's been in jail, unable to make bail. Look at the fate that our colleagues in Jammu and Kashmir are subjected to, where they do stories on different issues, not just the pandemic, but say human rights issues, and they get summoned to the police station for questioning. This is what I think is increasingly disturbing, and this is happening all over the country to varying degrees. That the police and the local district administration and state governments and chief ministers somehow think it is okay to hector and bully and to target journalists for the work that they do. And so if there is a third wave, you can be sure that journalists who are reporting the third wave, and if some of that reporting involves highlighting governmental failure, they will be targeted, just as they are being targeted for reporting human rights violations or communal clashes. So this is what I think disturbs me a great deal, and it was quite heartening. On several occasions we've heard the Honorable Chief Justice of India speak about the importance of investigative reporting, speak about the importance of freedom of the press. The Apex Court has been rather aware of the need to protect these freedoms, but that awareness hasn't filtered down all the way to the judiciary at every level. And I think that's what the police and governments count on, that when they take action against a journalist or a reporter, it takes time before her case, she's able to go all the way to the Supreme Court. And chances of getting relief at the local level often can be quite slim. So I think that the sensitivity that the Chief Justice of India and his colleagues have shown towards freedom of the press needs to be internalized across the board by the judiciary, of course, but also by public officials, by the police, by chief ministers and state ministers, because the media is an integral part of keeping democracy in India alive.
I want to now just move to possible solutions, because during the pandemic, when it was the turn to get vaccinated, we remember the Mumbai Press Club particularly raised funds from sponsors, actually sourced the vaccinations and offered it to journalists in Mumbai, saying, here are the, we will get you vaccinated. You don't have to wait for anyone else. Do you think that, given, Mr. Varadarajan, I'll ask the same question of Mr. Pant as well, do you think that, since you believe at this point, you said that the legal challenges are perhaps more severe, that organizations like the Mumbai Press Club should maybe raise funds to put forward legal representation for journalists who are particularly working as freelancers, who are working out of smaller platforms, who might not be able to afford the big gun, sort of legal responses?
प्रॉब्लम मैम जो स्टेट के जो प्रेस क्लब हैं वो लगभग खत्म होने की स्थिति में है। जैसे सिद्धार्थ जी ने बताया कि जर्नलिस्ट यूनियन भी बिल्कुल लगभग खत्म होने की स्थिति में है। एक चुनौती बना हुआ है, लगातार चुनौती बना हुआ है कि हमारे होने को खारिज करने की कोशिशें लगातार तेज हो रही है, बहुत तेजी से बढ़ रही है। हम सिर्फ इतना ही कहते हैं कि भाई अब जैसे कि दैनिक भास्कर है, सारी सरकारें उनके दोस्त हुआ करती थी कोविड से पहले, लेकिन जैसे कोविड आया, जैसे हमने उनके खिलाफ लिखना शुरू किया, सब हमारी दुश्मन हो गई सारी सरकारें। तो ये चलता रहेगा हमेशा, लेकिन हम सबसे यही कहते हैं कि आप हमसे सहमत या असहमत हो सकते हैं, लेकिन हमारा बचा रहना जरूरी है।
Very well said. Gentlemen, this brings us to the close. So thank you so much for joining us here at the RedInk Awards 2021 by the Mumbai Press Club. It has been a pleasure to speak with both of you. And thank you for the work that your teams have done over the last 2 years of putting forward the truth for the citizens of India. Back then again to next.